Mira could not have said precisely when the situation spiraled out of control. Moments earlier, she had been skirting the boundary of the Pack Alliance territory, scanning the horizon for potential threats. Now she found herself far beyond the safe zones, deep in Rogue's territory, with more than a dozen of them closing in. Their presence announced itself through low snarls and snapping jaws, an echo of violence that charged the damp air. Then, the unexpected happened. A young man, one Mira had met only briefly in the transition zone, plunged out of the undergrowth to intercept the rogues. At first, confusion flickered across her mind. It seemed impossible that someone from the Storm Pack, of all places, would risk his life for her. The Storm Pack was known for cruelty and fierce independence, reputed to show no mercy, especially toward those from the Pack Alliance. Yet there he was, bounding into danger. He shifted into his wolf form with impressive speed, launching himself into the fray. His dark fur rippled over powerful muscles, and he met the rogues head-on, lashing out with razor-sharp claws and snapping fangs. Though outnumbered, he fought with a brutal efficiency that caused the rogues to stumble. Myra's first thought was to flee while he occupied the rogues, but something in her gut twisted at the thought of leaving him behind to battle all of them alone. On the other hand, she had no real way to help. She could not shift at all and never had. It had been a problem haunting her since childhood, one that no healer had been able to remedy. In her human form, she was slower than any wolf and too vulnerable to direct attacks. Against all better judgment, Mira hesitated, peering from behind a cluster of trees as the young man tore through the rogues with unwavering determination. A few managed to land blows, claws scraping his flank or teeth sinking into his shoulder, but he kept turning, snarling, and throwing them off. More than once, he looked around frantically, as if searching for her position, ensuring she had not become a victim of the onslaught. Confusion warred with gratitude in her mind. By all accounts, someone from the Storm Pack should have no reason to protect her. Yet here he was, risking his life. The moment her eyes met his fierce gaze, he jerked his muzzle, signaling for her to run. She needed no further prompting. Mira scrambled away from the gruesome struggle, stumbling over mossy roots and wet leaves that slicked the ground. A sharp snap echoed behind her, followed by a pained yelp. It was impossible to determine whether it came from the young man or a rogue. Fear curled in her stomach, urging her to move faster, but her body felt clumsy and sluggish compared to the speed of wolf kind. Rounding a massive trunk, she pressed her back against the rough bark, panting. Her pulse roared as she tried to quell the panic building inside. The stench of blood, hot and metallic, hung thick in the humid air. Leaves rustled, and suddenly, she caught a glimpse of white fur creeping through the shadows. One of the rogues, larger than the others, was maneuvering around to find her. In an instant, the dark-furred wolf, the Storm Pack stranger, appeared, intercepting the rogue's lunge. The white-furred creature snarled and snapped, circling with malevolent intent. It was the leader, a hulking beast with a ragged scar across its muzzle and a cold glint in its eyes. It seemed determined to seize any advantage it could. Spotting Mira cowering behind the tree, the alpha rogue bared its fangs and lowered its body into a predatory stance. The young man sprang forward, placing himself between Mira and the rogue. For a few tense moments, claws and teeth blurred in a savage dance, both wolves snapping and clashing. But the rogue was not alone. Other rogues closed in, fully intent on exploiting Myra's vulnerability. One lunged at her from behind while the alpha rogue kept the dark-furred wolf occupied. With a startled cry, Mira scrambled to the side, but she slipped on damp leaves and fell onto her hands and knees. The snarling rogue advanced, jaws wide, about to strike. A heartbeat later, the young man slammed into that rogue, throwing it off balance. Despite fending off multiple attackers, he managed to keep Mira from a fatal mauling. Furious at their continued efforts to target her, the young man delivered a crushing bite to one rogue's leg, making it yowl and scamper back. Mira realized that she was not only helpless but also a dangerous distraction, splitting the young man's focus. Each time he checked on her, the rogues took advantage of the opening. In the midst of the chaos, One rogue sank its fangs into the young man's shoulder, tearing a chunk of flesh. He roared in pain, spun around, and flung the attacker aside. Blood oozed from the wound, staining his dark fur. Even so, he did not relent. Snapping his jaws, he forced the white-furred alpha and the others away from Mira. His stance radiated tenacity, but it was evident that continuous fighting and injury were taking a toll. "Move!" the young man growled, his voice warped by the wolf's muzzle. Mira sprang to her feet, heart hammering. Even if the direct order stung her pride, she could not argue. He clearly had the advantage in combat, whereas she would only hinder him further. She turned and sprinted deeper into the forest, ignoring the stinging scrape on her forearm where a rogue's claw had grazed her. Leaves whipped against her face, and her lungs felt on fire as she pushed forward. Behind her, the sounds of the fight continued. Fierce growls, the scuffle of paws, and vicious snarls. Occasionally, yelps and howls echoed among the dark trunks. She willed the young man to keep up and escape with her, but every nerve in her body screamed at her to just keep moving and evade the rogues. Eventually, those terrible sounds began to fade. The pounding of her heart slowly lessened, and she discovered that the young man had caught up. He darted ahead of her, apparently having managed to break away from the rogue pack. Blood darkened a patch of his fur, and his breaths came in ragged heaves. They continued stumbling forward, weaving between massive oaks and stepping around treacherous roots. Gradually, the forest grew quieter. The snarling rogues no longer seemed to be on their heels. They slowed, each step weighted with relief and exhaustion. In a dense section of the woods, the young man lifted his muzzle and sniffed the air. After a moment of tense waiting, he jerked his head toward a mossy outcropping of rock. Beneath it lay the yawning entrance of a small cave, draped with vines and lichen. Mira hesitated. The cave looked dim and unwelcoming, yet it might be enough to hide them from prying eyes and snapping teeth. Her strength was quickly flagging, and she wanted nothing more than to rest, even if that meant stepping into a stone-walled enclosure. They crept inside, careful not to make noise. The interior was clammy and smelled of damp earth. Jagged stones jutted up from the floor, and water dripped from the ceiling, forming tiny puddles. Once they moved a few steps in, the young man shifted back to his human form. He stumbled as soon as his feet touched the cold stone, nearly collapsing from the pain in his shoulder. Even under the dim light, the glimmer of blood was evident where the rogue's bite had torn flesh. He pressed a hand over the wound, sucking in a sharp breath. Myra's eyes swept over him, taking in the dark hair plastered to his brow by sweat, the sharp angles of his jaw, and the strain in his features. He was younger than she had initially assumed, perhaps near her own age. She noticed the flicker of agony in his gaze. It took him a few seconds to steady himself and turn his attention back to her. "What were you doing in this forest?" he demanded, his voice still laced with anger and adrenaline. "Didn't I warn you not to come here?" Mira sank onto a flat rock. Her entire body still quivered, and her breaths came in shallow bursts. "You might have said something," she replied in a shaky tone, "but I never heard the full warning. You seemed so threatening back in the transition zone. You were from the storm pack and you kept moving toward me, so you ran." He finished with a note of bitterness. "Straight into rogue territory. Exactly what I told you not to do." A wave of helpless anger and fear welled within Mira. She wanted to retort but found that she had no energy to muster a sharp reply. All at once, the swirling emotions of the day overwhelmed her. Her shoulders tensed, and tears burned behind her eyes. Until that very moment, she had been convinced she could hold it together. She was trained from a young age to maintain composure under pressure. Yet the accumulation of terror and exhaustion finally cracked her exterior. She began to cry, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. The young man, who had faced down a dozen rogues without hesitation, suddenly looked more lost than ever. He glanced away, shifting uncomfortably, as though uncertain whether he should approach her or keep his distance. His own labored breathing and pain-hazed expression attested to how much energy he had spent in the battle. Minutes passed while Myra's tears fell in quivering sobs. Her body shook with the release of so much pent-up fear. Meanwhile, the young man rubbed a hand across his face, avoiding eye contact. Eventually, Myra's sobs lessened into ragged breaths. The cave filled with an uneasy silence. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, cheeks flushed with both embarrassment and residual anguish. "Feeling better?" the young man asked, his voice far more subdued than before. "Somewhat," she whispered, glancing up at him through tear-dampened lashes. She could tell he was in no position to offer comfort. He wore the look of someone who had no idea how to handle a crying person. He took a slow breath, fighting off the dizziness threatening to overtake him. "I'm Baird," he said at last, watching her intently. "In case you missed it earlier." She nodded, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. "Mira," she managed in response. The name sounded small and unsteady, like she was clinging to an identity that felt distant after the chaos of the night. Silence fell again. Outside, the rustling of leaves provided a soft backdrop. Myra's attention drifted to the wound in Baird's shoulder. Blood trickled from the puncture marks, staining his shirt and dripping onto the ground. Before she could comment, he fixed her with a weary stare. "So why did you ignore my warning?" he asked. "I told you the forest was infested with rogues. Yet you went in anyway." Mira felt anger spark again, though it was muted by her utter exhaustion. "I didn't ignore you," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "I panicked. You were from the storm pack and you looked ready to attack. When you started speaking, I couldn't make out your exact words because all I could think of was getting away. You think I wanted to scare you on purpose?" Baird retorted, brow furrowing. "I saw you wandering near the border and tried to stop you from getting deeper into rogue territory. The storm pack doesn't want trouble with the rogues any more than you do. But by the time I got close, you ran." "I had no reason to trust you," Mira shot back. "You nearly cornered me." Baird released a dry, humorless chuckle, but the tension on his features never relaxed. He raised his uninjured hand in a gesture of frustration. "It's not as though I went out of my way to creep up on you. If you had given me 5 seconds, you would have heard my entire warning before sprinting off." They glared at each other in the dim light. Every bone in Myra's body ached, and the scratch on her arm throbbed dully. She hated the fact that she felt indebted to him even while her emotions churned with resentment. "You know what?" she muttered, her voice trembling. "If you hadn't startled me, I wouldn't have rushed into the forest in the first place. We wouldn't be hiding in a cave, and you wouldn't be bleeding everywhere." Baird opened his mouth to argue, but a bout of dizziness gripped him. He wavered where he stood, color draining from his face. Myra's defiant expression melted into alarm when she realized just how pale and unsteady he had become. "Hey," she said, rising from her seat. "Are you—" She never got the question out. Baird glowered at her, anger still flaring in his eyes, but then his lids fluttered. He lurched forward, unable to maintain his balance. Before she could react, he crumpled to the ground, landing on his side with a dull thud. "Baird!" Fear sliced through Mira like a blade. She dropped to her knees beside him, heart hammering. Gently, she eased him onto his back so she could see his face. His breathing was shallow, his eyes closed, and the lines of pain etched around his mouth were stark. Panic gripped her chest, threatening to choke off her breath. She pressed her hand against his wound, feeling the warm slick of blood saturating her fingers. The flow was steady enough to alarm her, and she realized she had nothing but her torn shirt and trembling hands to rely on.